Okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to intersectional environmental feminisms in the digital space. This is part of the Feminist Digital Methods Conference, and I just wanted to say a word about the I can't talk. I'm sleep deprived because I have a newborn. And I was telling Rachel that I've been like tripping over my words lately, which will make this panel very interesting. So, anyways, this is the Feminist Digital Methods Conference. And this is a conference that's sponsored by the Center for Feminist Research at York University. And this is a conference that my friend Sarah York Bertram and I have been organizing for the last year. And it came out of the pandemic and thinking about how the pandemic really has us living in and researching in and working in digital spaces more and more. So the idea behind this conference was to get folks together to talk about how these digital methods and spaces, et cetera, are interweaving with our feminist methodologies and feminist practices, et cetera. So this is the third preliminary event before the conference, and the conference will take place next week, the main conference, Thursday through Saturday, and it's open access and free, and anyone can sign up. We have a couple workshops, a plenary, a keynote, and 5 panel sessions. So it should be really great. And this conversation today kind of came out of me connecting the organization of this conference with my main work in environmental scholarship. So I'm excited to be here today. I'm going to hand it over to Rachel Lutz, who is going to be moderating this panel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here to moderate this wonderful conversation. If you have any comments or questions, please put them into the YouTube chat, and hopefully we'll be able to integrate them into our conversation today. A word about me. My name is Rachel Lutz, as I've said. I am a historian and high school teacher in Northern New Jersey, and I'm working on several book projects, one of which is coming out in March called American Energy Cinema with West Virginia Press. And I'm here today as a representative from the Women's Environmental History Network. And we work to create connections between women and women identifying scholars in environmental history and related fields. You can find out more about us at our website on envhistwomen.com, and the same name on Twitter if you're interested in learning more about how to connect with fellow scholars in that field. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 3 panelists here today, and then they'll go through and give a 5 to 10 minute introduction on their own work. So Jessica, who just spoke, is an environmental historian of Canada and the United States, and she's editor and digital communication strategist as well. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Saskatchewan in 2019, and she's an executive member, editor-in-chief, and social media editor for the Network in Canadian History and Environment. She's also a working board member of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, Girls Rock Saskatoon, and a core organizer of Showing Up for Racial Justice Saskatoon, Treaty 6. A passionate social justice advocate, she focuses on developing digital techniques and communications that bridge the divide between academia and the general public in order to democratize knowledge access. Madeline Jubilee Saito was supposed to be with us today, but she's not here. Jacqueline Scott is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in social justice education. She is a fellow at the Safina Center, and her research on the perception of wilderness in the Black Canadian imagination. In other words, she is studying how to make outdoor recreation a more welcoming and inviting space for Black people, and is part of a larger project on race, place, and nature. Scott is also a writer and speaker on race and nature, and her work has appeared in The Conversation, the Canadian Broadcasting Corp, and Spacing. She has been interviewed by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and La Presse. Ramya Swayamprakash is an assistant professor in integrative religious and intercultural studies at the Brooks Center of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Missouri, a transnational and interdisciplinary environmental scholar who focuses on rivers, dredging, and the place of nature in the Great Lakes. Ramya's research has been published in academic and public-facing avenues. She takes tea and dredging, not necessarily in that order, very seriously. Ramya has also published work on dams in South Asia. And as a survivor of domestic abuse and as a single parent, Ramya's scholarship is driven by a commitment to social and ecological justice and equity. And Diana Valencia Duarte is a PhD in history from the University of Exeter. Her research interests range on peasant cultures, socio-environmental conflicts, and agroecological food systems using social scientists and or historical methods with an emphasis on oral memory, environmental history, gender and generational analysis, and decolonial, participative, and interdisciplinary approaches by principle. Her studies have focused on Colombian peasantries, but she is and has been also involved in research and educational projects related with Black communities in the UK and Nigeria. So thank you so much for our participants for sharing the time with us today. And Jacqueline, would you like to start first with an introduction about yourself and your work?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So I am Jacqueline Scott, and my research interests are basically around the intersection between race and nature. My PhD thesis, it's called Black Outdoors, the Perception of the Wilderness and the Black Canadian Imagination. And what I'm looking at is what is the Black Canadian experience in hiking, in camping, and in snowshoeing? Now, outdoor recreation is the quintessential Canadian experience. Think of all those kids who go to summer camp as a rite of passage. And if you think of the marketing images of Canada, it's always the great outdoors. And Canada is the land of ice and snow. We're the land of the great outdoors. We're the land of we, the North. What I'm interested in is who is the we in we, the North? How is that we shaped by race and by ideas of what is nature and who belongs in nature and who does not belong in nature? And race and nature are intertwined. So whether it's camping, whether it's the distribution of trees in the city, whether it is who has access to park space in the city, who has access to gardens, who has access to clean water, race and nature becomes intertwined. And that is essentially what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Ramya, your turn.
Hi, sorry. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Ramya. Apart from being an assistant professor, I'm also a proud member of the Environmental History Now team. And as a recently former international graduate student in the US, who meandered into environmental history and history via many places, degrees, and ideas, for the longest time, I wasn't really sure if academia would work for me. And so avenues like environmental history now have been lifesavers, really. Broadly, my research and life have centered around water and infrastructure and processes that help us see more clearly how inextricably linked these two are. I used to love to say that, I don't study people and that's why I study environmental history. But because everyone's far more serious now, I stopped being facetious. But what interested me about environmental history, and I think what Jacqueline said so beautifully, is how we relate to our place in the world, right? Like that, and who gets to be in and out. And that's what interests me about environmental history. And so my doctoral work, which was on the Detroit River along the Michigan-Ontario border, revolved around trying to figure how certain human-made infrastructures became a part of the river. Sweetheart, just one second. Became a part of the river itself, and how people who lived along the river how they understood it or didn't understand these infrastructures. So given my intellectual background in graduate school especially, I became interested in spaces that were outside the academy simply because I wasn't sure if the academy fit for me, right? And so digital spaces like Environmental History Now, Niche, and Contingent were amazing collaborative open spaces. And so much of my research has actually changed thanks to the access that I've enjoyed to these spaces. Yeah.
Thank you, Ramya. Diana, your turn.
Hi, thank you. So yes, my name is Diana, a PhD in history in the University of Exeter. My research was centered in the environmental history and social history of three Colombian peasantries from 1961 to 2013. I look into the agrarian/peasant question in Colombia. Very interested in how sometimes agrarian policies can have counter-reformist effects when they break the bonds between peasant culture and nature, causing a process that we call depeasantization in the territories, also loss of food sovereignty, and a damaging environmental impact in these three territories, basically. I have also been involved with the Environmental History Now, which more than just a platform to speak freely, like a platform to reflect out loud and put your work in conversation with other women environmental historians. It's also a wider community, and it has helped me, of course, to shape my arguments a little better, to think differently about my work, also to have a digital presence out there. It has given me a space to have a voice for the peasantries I work with as well, which is very important for me, like that part of the scholarship that is not just academia, but also a bit of committed research and activism. Because to me, it's important not to be neutral when the communities you work with are being oppressed. And part of what I hope we can talk about today is about that, like academia traditionally advise you to be neutral and not to be involved. And that's something that as a decolonial researcher or committed researcher, or however your positionality is not possible, really, and it's not desirable. So environmental history has given me a space to do that, but probably we can talk about that later more deeply. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to choose a question to sort of start us off. And
can I go?
Yes, sorry, Jessica.
It's okay. Hi, I'm Jessica DeWitt, as we heard earlier. I've already spoken, so yeah, I see my work as there's the environmental scholarship side and there's the environmental activism side, and I kind of try to blur those things together, but they don't always completely blur together, right? And I think there's some issues with that, and there's just some practicalities about that, but my digital presence that interweaves with feminism has an origin story in 2014. So I would have been in my third year of my PhD at that time. I went to my first niche event, and it was a workshop, and there was only about 3 or 4 women there. And the other women at the workshop were established scholars. And there was a point at the workshop that we were just, the women were separate and talking. And I was warned that niche was a boys' club, and that, they don't feel particularly welcome at niche events. That, environmental history as as a field was a boys club as well. And I was, be a little baby grad student, and I hadn't really thought about these things yet. But I think the boys club aspect of environmental history is a broader issue. I think it's a broader issue for environmental anthropology, sociology, all environmental scholarship. And I also think it's a problem in environmentalism as a whole, because it has been so dominated by white cis men. And that is changing. But this, in 2014, this kind of corresponded when I became social media editor for Niche. And I kind of sat back and I was like, okay, I feel welcome at Niche, but how do I make other people feel welcome? And how do I make other people like me feel welcome? Other people who haven't been represented by the organization as much in the past. And that's when I kind of turned to feminist theory. I've written before a lot of the very simple theory of Anne Freeman and Minatou So's shine theory is something that, it's very simple. It's I don't shine if you don't shine. And at the time, that very simple phrase really connected with me. And I was like, well, that really makes sense to me. And I have this power with this social media account and being connected to this organization to use this idea to really uplift other people and to start making the space more diverse and and more inclusive. And I really wanted to start breaking down hierarchies in environmental history. And so that's a lot of what I've done over the last, 8-9 years now. And as I became, more established as a scholar and my role at Niche became more, I just continued to really emphasize breaking down these hierarchies and being inclusive. And I also see, particularly when I started, there was a lot of anxiety for early career scholars about being online, about being yourself online and being, professional and proper, etc. And I still think that's a problem or a concern that people have. But I think that a lot of work has been done to kind of break down those ideas that you have to present yourself in this professional manner, which is a very colonial patriarchal ideal. So I took it upon myself to just be myself, in digital spaces, to not censor myself, and to just be my full, queer, rambunctious, mischievous self, questioning things and not presenting a particularly clean version of myself to the public. Like, if you follow me, then you follow me for my digital scholarship and you follow me for all those other things. And I'm a person, I'm a whole person. And I realized that I'm in a position, in my positionality in society, where I can do that and make it more comfortable for other people to do that. So I've done that also very intentionally. And a lot of this has taken place in academic spheres, of course. But I do see my research and my work in environmental history to be a form of environmental activism, because that's the skills that I'm bringing to the environmental movement, right? And to make a distinction between those things, I think, is disingenuous. I also think that it's, again, a patriarchal colonial mindset that these things should be separate. So what is the point of us doing any of this? There is no point if we're just talking to ourselves, if we're not going out and bringing all of this knowledge that we're collecting and just using it for ourselves, for our own advancement. There's no point. So I think that also is really important. And I also think that, there's this linear idea of progress that is really, as environmental historians, we can really push back on. The linear, again, is something that is patriarchal, colonial, this idea, but we as environmental historians and as feminist scholars, et cetera, can push back on that and really show that, it's cyclical, right? All of this knowledge and all of the things that have come in the past, et cetera. And we're in a position to really highlight that to the public and to really kind of be in conversation with them. Finally, I'm talking a lot, but I think reciprocity is just so important. And part of that reciprocity in being in digital spaces is knowing when to talk and knowing when you're supposed to be in the background and just supporting. So I try to use my algorithmic power, because I think like I have a lot of followers for an academic. But being conscious of that and using that to really uplift people who are outside of academia who are doing the good work, right? Or people who are just starting their careers, et cetera. And really being conscious of those in digital spaces. I think that's all I have to say to begin with, and then we can go into our chats.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing a bit about yourselves here. I'm going to start with a question that's a bit broad, but will hopefully fracture out in different ways to sort of address this, the content of our conversation today. So, how has online publishing and social media changed environmental scholarship and activism over the past 5 or 6 years from your perspective? A follow-up to sort of think about while we're thinking about what changes things have, the digital spaces make is a way to is to consider how we might better teach others to access the digital sphere within academia. So how has online publishing and social media changed environmental activism and scholarship? And what are some ways that we can continue to bring in the digital sphere to academia through graduate studies? What do you think?
I'll speak to the second part of the question first. In that, from my own experience, when I was going through grad school, none of the work that I did digitally was respected when it came to my department or my committee. They continuously asked me to stop, said that it wasn't worth my time and wasn't going to advance my career. They couldn't have been more wrong. And I always continued to do whatever I wanted. But I think that that is beginning to change as those of us who have come up in the digital sphere in the last 10 years know the power of it and are going to becoming, Ramya just became a professor, like we're going to be changing that. But I think there's such a long way to go. And I think that there has to be some way of the problem is that you have to quantify all this stuff, right? You have to be able to, have the metrics, and that's a larger academic issue. But the people who are in power, who have tenure, et cetera, are the ones that are going to have to push back on that first. They're going to have to break through and demand that their work and the work of their grad students and their adjunct colleagues, et cetera, is taken seriously. I'll stop rambling.
I just want to piggyback on what Jessica said. To be honest, I don't think I would have gotten my job if I didn't have a digital presence. And it wasn't, Jessica's experience is sort of similar to what mine was, in that I wasn't asked to not do it, but it wasn't encouraged either, right? And I do believe that just going out and doing the things that I thought were important went a long way in helping me have greater control of the online presence that I was having. But I think it also helped me reach a diversity of people and publics. And for the job that I have gotten, I think that was a good fit. I'm not sure that would have been a good fit for every university, But the place that I have thankfully landed, it's a good fit for me. So yeah, I feel like that is slowly changing. I see my colleagues being far more intentional about curating their online presence. But there is a great deal of power that doesn't exist, obviously, um, with grassroots and early career scholars that needs to be wielded by tenured faculty when it comes to, acknowledging, welcoming these spaces as important scholarship, not just scholarship, but like important, critical, time-sensitive scholarship, right? So yeah.
I think for me, digital space has always been, from the start of my PhD, it was one of my goals, and partly because I like to write, and partly as well is that I'm in the Faculty of Education at OISE. I'm doing an interdisciplinary degree, but my work doesn't fit neatly into categories. And because of that, I found that writing about my experience on the blog was a way for me to try and figure out what exactly are you trying to research? And by writing the blog post, it forced me, or it encouraged me to tease out, what are the main strands? What are the main issues that you're actually facing in trying to put this PhD together? Because there isn't a shelf full of books on what is it I'm trying to do. The only one that's really out there is Carolyn Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces. That's the only book. And it's the go-to guide for my research. But by having a digital presence, it allowed me to sort out my ideas. And for me, much more importantly, it also allowed me to connect with other Black people who are involved in outdoor recreation and to realize that my experience is not unique. And that was absolutely essential to learn that, because so often in outdoor spaces, I'm the sole Black face. And so what that often means is a sense of you don't belong in the space. Meeting other Black activists who are involved in outdoor recreation, other Black scholars, it's like, no, you're not unique. And there is a bigger issue that's going on in the field. And so that for me was really affirming. And the second thing I'd like to add briefly is that there is an assumption that digital space, digital environmentalism, digital humanities is neutral. It's not. The white dominance that we see in environmentalism, it's the same white dominance that also occurs in digital spaces. And a good example of that, when I think of Vanessa Nakate, young environmental leader on a global scale, has a massive digital presence, but she still has to justify her role in the environmental movement. And especially when you think of that Davos photograph where she's cropped out of it. So the idea that digital space is race neutral does not hold up at all. It reflects the power hierarchies, it reflects the privileges in the environmental sector in general. And what that means is usually the erasure of Black voices, the erasure of people of color voices, and especially when we are offering a counter narrative to the idea that environmentalism is neutral, that nature is neutral. No, it's not. The digital media is no different.
So I think I go last. I would probably like to talk about my own path. Digital humanities are kind of fairly new to me, or from my perspective. I used to have a presence online since probably 2010 in the usual social networks such as Instagram or Facebook. But I wasn't really keen on those. And although I've been part of communities in WhatsApp or Telegram, and not also a big fan, I'm more like a Twitter person. That was kind of my quick connection to the world, of course, keeping measures of cybersecurity, but also when initiatives as Environmental History Now, these social networks have been like the door who opened me towards that digital humanities stage and communities. So it allowed me to reach different networks, connect with other people. Like at the same time that I was sort of studying my PhD. I could connect with persons and organizations in digital humanities and more other areas of interest. And environmental history now is in itself very young. It has like 4 years. It was created by Elizabeth Hamitiman in 2018. And she has been continually offering the space for new colleagues, which has allowed our community to grow quite rapidly. So we have almost 150 women, trans and non-binary contributors from different origins right now. And there has been like more than 200 posts already published. And my first blog in environmental history now was called actually the carbon footprint of environmental research, a personal dilemma. I was highly worried about how much carbon equivalent was emitting just by doing field trips for my own work. And that was a year before COVID. I was at the time analyzing mainly the excessive airplane traveling to do environmental research and dissemination. And I was trying to think of alternatives to reduce our research environmental footprint. Because after all, we also talk about environmental justice in our work, and a high impact of the climate crisis have been suffered by women within those marginalized communities worldwide we work with. And since 2020, I was invited to be part of the content editor team, which is a position where I am very comfortable, very happy, because I have the opportunity to learn a lot every time I read a new post. It's very interesting that Elizabeth has seems to know my areas of interest because of the topics of those spots she assigned to me, like mostly related to communities, indigeneity, social nature, territoriality, so on. I'm very happy as editing content because I think it's a unique position to be the first person in dialogue with authors writing. This is kind of a privilege. They are always brilliant. And it's also a personal challenge because you're the responsible to take the post to the next level. And you are always thinking, how can I support this author to improve the post or complement and extend the reflections from my own scholarship. But that was again the year of COVID, which meant that many encounters and meetings had to be no longer in presence but virtually, which is a huge. I don't know if we all miss being in person, so it's probably a curse, but it's also a great solution. And well, we started to also organize virtual panels as environmental history now, particularly based on the tag problems of place. And they have been a great opportunity to reflect on problems related with our place of research, place of knowledge, and all associated with our practice. But the most important element is that those panels are very open, like organic and creative. So from all the conference I've been to and all the papers I have delivered, like probably this have been the most fun, relaxed, enjoyable of them all. So I would like to finish with the idea that even though it's virtual, there is a huge sense of friendship, deep understanding, shared experiences camaraderie and highlighting that is very important to take care of each other, that this virtual connection, even though it's virtual, help us to find support groups and people that you get to know deeper and care for them in exercising a sort of kindness that I think is very important to keep. I'd really like the virtual meetings to keep on going, regardless that we can do things presentially right now, because these events in certain countries have a lot of barriers for other peers from the global south, not just talking about the carbon emissions on the airplanes, let's talking about the whole process and cost of visas and the whole problem with the xenophobia and profiling wherever they go, wherever we go and present our passports. So I guess that the virtual encounters have that potential of inclusion that probably those events in presence have not previously. And I've talked so much, so I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you so much for your comments. I'd like to ask a question that builds on Jacqueline's comment from a few moments ago, but also kind of merges a few questions that we had in our draft document about questions. And I think we'll kind of get to the heart. I think this question is going to kind of get to the heart of why we are having this panel in the first place, right? Why this conversation is so necessary. But what are things that scholars can do in the digital sphere to challenge these kinds of patriarchal oppression and white dominance that we find in these scholarly spaces, right? What does the digital world allow us to do to challenge those relationships? And this is addressed to everyone in the panel, of course. And I also have some questions from the audience that I'd like to shift to in a minute. But I do want to think about what methods that we can share with the audience that have worked for us in sort of challenging these relationships and trying to create a more equitable space for scholarship more broadly.
One of the big issues is that the digital humanities sphere is dominated by 3 countries: Canada, the USA, and England. I was really surprised when I learned that, because again, the idea is that digital technology is supposed to democratize space. It's supposed to democratize communication. Well, it clearly isn't. And one of the things I'm interested in is how this has real world consequences in terms of how we relate to nature. A typical example being in that in Canada, we have some absolutely marvelous national parks and provincial parks that I spend way too much time in, but those national parks were created on the idea that nature is neutral and that pristine nature is free of people. And so it becomes a way of legitimizing the dispossession of indigenous people from their land in order to create those national parks. But that model of conservation has become the dominant model in terms of how we think about nature and conserving it. And because it's coming from the North and reflects a very Eurocentric, American Eurocentric view of nature, when that is taken as natural and as neutral, and it's perpetuated by scholars from the global North, then for those in the global South, it becomes much harder to argue around the colonialism that's built into that model. And that is why, for example, real life consequences. Tanzania is creating a new national park, and the first step, kick out the Maasai, drag them out from their traditional lands. India is creating a new national park, and the first step is kick out the tribals from their lands. And so the Euro-American idea of what is nature and how we relate to it becomes a dominant one. It's dominant not only on the ground, it's dominant in academia. And when the academics are based in the global North, it seems to create a never-ending circle. But to follow up on what Deanna was saying, it's the need to, if you are aware of that, it's then taking the next steps to say, okay, How do we build bridges to the global South? How do we build relationships to those academics in the South who are working on the same issues? How do we create space for them so that they can offer their own alternative version of what this nature, the environment looks like and who has access to it? But all of that takes work and it takes resources and it takes transferring some of that resources to the global South. Because you're on digital, it makes the work just a little bit easier, but you still actually have to do the work. And I think sometimes we forget that and we think, oh, just send out a quick email or follow on Twitter and everything is done. It doesn't work like that. So for me, digital has a promise, but you still have to recognize that it is work. And if we have time a little bit later on, I'll talk about my blog in terms of the work that goes into writing the blog. It's not a straightforward, easy, just set up a blog and run it. It doesn't work like that. And I think we underestimate the amount of work it takes in order to have a digital presence. And especially if part of that presence is engaging in public engagement.
I think that what Jacqueline just said also speaks to, the dominance of the English language in environmental spaces. And even within niche, we struggle with this because technically we're a bilingual website and organization, but our French representation is next to nil, despite our best efforts, or maybe not our best efforts. Also just the idea that scholars and environmentalists have to, if they're doing a digital presence, a lot of the digital landscape is dominated and gatekept by people in the global north, particularly in the States or in the UK, as Jacqueline noted, or in Canada. So if they want to get any kind of traction or be taken seriously, then they have to write and manage their digital presence in English. And, as someone who is English speaking and only has a rough understanding of German and French, I can, that's great for me. And I struggle with how to, when I don't have those language skills, how do I support those people who want to write in these other languages? And I think environmental history now has their initiative where they've started translating pieces and publishing pieces in languages other than English, which I think is really important. But yeah, I think that's a barrier that's really important to discuss in digital spaces, and one that I don't necessarily have a solution for, but I think that we need to take seriously.
That's a huge challenge, like the plurilingualism that we've been trying to address in environmental history now, like trying to publish more in other languages, because of our logistic that and the form we put those posts in dialogue first with editors, and the process of previous dialogue we have before we actually go live with any post. It requires a huge effort, like having the availability of bilingual content editors and final editors, and some of us are some of those. For example, one of the posts I created in 2020, I do it twice, basically, a version in English and a version in Spanish, and it required, of course, twice the amount of work by two different content editors speaking two different languages, and also final editors. So we're on that path, but yeah, the number of posts in English is still massively larger than the ones we have managed to post in other languages. So still need to work a lot on that. Like virtually as well, it's very hard and still very expensive to host plurilingual virtual panels. is a huge logistic effort, and it's definitely something that we need to somehow address.
Yeah, I think with niche, like even when we invite French language posts, we rarely get any submissions, which shows that Francophone in scholars and individuals who might write for us don't feel like we are their community, right? And I think that's a huge problem. Yeah.
I have another, Diana, do you have a follow-up? Otherwise, I have a follow-up question from the audience that kind of hits this same comment. So I have a few audience questions. One is from Feminist Digital Methods. What ideas and experiences do you have in shifting resources to disrupt the Global North's monopoly on resources and access?
I think part of the first step is actually building relationships, and relationships takes time and they take effort. And we're all very busy, and that can become its own excuse for not spending the time in terms of building those relationships. I also, when I think about citational practices, every field has its canon of work. And because I'm interested in race, how does race shape who gets into the canon? And so it's stepping beyond the canon, looking at how that canon is undergirded by a particular worldview, a particular theory of knowledge, stepping away from that and finding the other scholars, because there are other scholars out there. Find the scholars of color who are writing about similar issues and make them be part of your citational practice. That requires a political awareness that scholarship, that knowledge production is not neutral. And because knowledge production is not neutral and it reinforces its existing hierarchies, it's stepping away from that and saying, okay, how do I find others who are offering either a similar narrative or a counter narrative? How do I use their citations to bring attention to the work that they are doing? And that is something that I am still learning as I'm now nearing the very end of my data collection and I'm starting to think about writing my thesis. And so for me, these discussions go from being, well, theoretically, you could do this to now you actually have to go and find those alternative scholarships and read them and cite them. And so, and sometimes that becomes double the work. But for me, it is work that I'm committed to, and it's work that it is doing, because once again, it's putting your money where your mouth is, but it is extra work and it's following through on that.
Thank you,
And
Jacqueline.
the other quick point I would also add is that so many times in the scholarship, I see work where white authors have not always credited that the source of their ideas are actually coming from person of color scholars. And so you can begin to trace the genealogy of ideas and realize, hey, wait a minute, this is coming from here, but it's not cited. So it becomes another form of exploitation and another form of extraction, and it becomes part of the politics of knowledge production.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think citational sort of changes are important. The other sort of meta thing that I've been involved in for the last couple of years is to also change how we think of scholarship. So, an initiative I've been a part of is called Flip the List, and the idea is that we're trying to make the Wikipedia entries on the Wikipedia page on like the list of environmental books to actually reflect the diversity of scholarship and ideas, right? Um, because especially when we're in a classroom and kids are going to use Google, and everybody goes on Wikipedia. Let's acknowledge it and move with it. So how do we make Wikipedia more robust, diverse, and actually representative of the multitude of kinds of scholarship that are available, right? And bring out the great work that people are doing, and sort of fight the erasure that people of color have been facing, right? That's not to say that this has been easy or straightforward, but nothing in life is. But it has been an affirming process, right? Just because and this is something I plan to use in my classroom, getting students especially to, like, right at the get-go, especially undergraduates, to not just read more thoughtfully, but to also be able to sort of bring that reading into a citational practice. Like, how do you read and cite scholars of color? Right? And how do you then build a body of knowledge that is grounded in scholarship that goes beyond the white pantheon, right? And so that it's a slow process, but I think it's a fulfilling process. And that's another thing that could be done, I guess.
I have a quick thing I would like to share. I'm not a commenter, so please forgive me for sharing one thought about this. I have been thinking a lot, being involved with the Women's Environmental History, about how to diversify a lot of the scholarship that I do, which admittedly isn't a lot. But one of the things that I decided to do is I am editing a edited collection. It's the second one I'm working on, and I'm actually requiring, in a sort of informal manner, I'm requiring all of my authors to take a few minutes to consider diversifying their secondary scholarship. And I've shared all the links with them about Flip the Lists and different syllabuses that have women environmental history on it. And when they submit their drafts to me, which was actually last week, they also have to submit to me a couple of sentences on how they're incorporating diverse scholars and diverse voices into the secondary sources that they're using for the articles that we're using to write my book. And I don't feel like that's a lot, but I do think that that's like a real on the ground thing that we can do as scholars. Like, when we're working with people on projects, talk about how you're trying to do that in your own work. Try to incorporate that into the project you're doing. I've been thinking about how to do that for my manuscript, and I think it's going to be a lot of work, but I think it's important that I contribute, that I make that change for my manuscript as much as I can, as well as some of the other projects I'm working on. So I just wanted to share that tidbit. Does anybody else want to share what they're thinking?
Just from a perspective as editor-in-chief of Niche's website, in the last couple of years, we have really opened up our contributorship to people from everywhere. And it's been an uncomfortable process inside at times when we are thinking of our identity as Niche, as the network in Canadian history and environment. But as our influence and our website readership has grown, the people who want to write for us has grown as well. And I think that as scholars and a group that have quite a bit of clout in the digital space, we have a responsibility to open up that space to people from everywhere. And, you know, I spearheaded our Succession Queering the Environment series, where we've published queer ecology scholarship for the first time. And, you know, we have our water pedagogies series right now, which is almost entirely writers from the global South. And, you know, 5 years ago, this would never have been published on Niche, right? And it's interesting to see that evolution that's almost happened naturally, but also with some pushback and some hesitancy on the part of us, you know, because we're like, how do we maintain our identity, our clear identity? But again, that clear identity is based in this academic system where we have to legitimize ourselves based on geography and you know, our education, our educational pedigree, right? And if we're going to make an impact outside of academia and outside of Canada and the United States, then we kind of have to let go of those things and, you know, be more flexible, or at least, you know, when I say we, I shouldn't be speaking on behalf of everyone in Niche, but that's how I'm feeling. So yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Can I just make a quick comment to that? And it's the sense that in Toronto, people of color are 55% of the population. We're not the minority, we're the majority. And so when I look at scholarship, you know, people are coming as immigrants from different parts of the world here. But when they come, they bring their relationship to their environment with them. And so, and this is not specifically directed at niche, but when I look at organizations, it's like people are coming from nature. The nature here, yeah, different animals, different birds, whatever, but they can still relate to nature. If you're talking about water, we've all seen rivers, we've all seen lakes. And it's a sense of, well, why can't they talk about, while based in Canada, their relationship to the water, the tree, or whatever it is? And that becomes your Canadian framing. But it just strikes me as part of the bigger issue in environmentalism, where you hit the white wall, where the Canadian experience and the Canadian experience is really a code word for we want white. The lack of Canadian experience is like, yeah, we still want white. But there's opportunities because people of color are the majority to say your experience with nature, whether it's over there or here, it still counts. And to have that reflected in the scholarship. And so, yeah, the conversations are messy, it can be uncomfortable, but it's better than the denial, as in the environment is neutral.
Yeah, I find that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
I just
Jessica.
find
My
that
apologies.
a lot of our designations that we have, environmental humanities, environmental history, environmental archaeology, all of these distinctions are very artificial in a lot of ways, that we have, like, we're just talking about the same things and often not speaking to each other. And I think that often happens also with, scholars versus environmentalists, and these artificial lines that we draw around ourselves that just keep us from moving forward, because the future that we want, it, it it requires us to move beyond these things. So yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I have 3 questions from audience members that I'd like to get to, and I'd like to start with a comment or a question from Sritama Chatterjee. They ask, how do you make visible the metrics of digital public scholarship? What do you think?
That's a good question, because I don't think that it's a slippery slope. That's a terrible term, but I'm going there. Because I get worried when people get wrapped up into like influencer ideas of the digital space, where metrics are the thing. So I think I've seen people mention like, oh, for my department, I need to show that I've reached, 60,000 people or what have you. But at the same time, those metrics can be very powerful in showing that we have an influence. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think people who are in positions where they can share that kind of information and kind of be open about, how many people have you reached, should do so, and that makes it more open for other people to share. But again, that metric thing just becomes into a race, and that's not what we want, right? We want to have, I want people to be focused on when they're in the digital space on like real connections, real relationship building, because we have the metrics also make it seem more fake. There's this idea that digital interactions are not real or as good. And I always argue that that's completely false. They're different and they have their own issues and problems, and definitely, and they're also still very embedded in capitalism, like this capitalist hellscape that we're in. But they're not any less real than in-person interactions, in my opinion. So when we get into these metrics and stuff, it can kind of bring it into out of that real space and make it seem I don't know. I mean, quantifiable. But at the same time, in these systems that we're in, we're required to do that. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. I think it's an issue that I don't have the answer to, but.
I completely agree. I mean, my short answer to Sritama would have been, which would have been a cop out, would have been to say it has to be embedded in relationships and not numbers. Um, Sorry, we live in a city. Okay then. So anyway, so it I think the the impact of these of digital scholarships needs to be far more community embedded and communicated. I'm not I'm not quite sure. I think it might require a change in our vocabulary of how we understand metrics. Because, like Jessica pointed out, like, we're in a capitalist hellscape. This idea of quantifying is problematic in and of itself. However, I'm not quite sure how communities might quant. Sorry, this is how communities might quantify. How communities might quantify the impact of digital scholarship. Sorry, I'm completely like taken aback by this noise, sudden noise. I'm just gonna go see what that is.
Well, is that metrics is one of those things that we need to challenge as a patriarchal perspective related to ranking and competing instead of establishing solidarity networks and relationships. So they are dehumanizing and they have a very limited way to understand the potential impact of the impact of a research or a communication. That's for one thing, and for the other, I understand that research just is one tool, but not the most important thing. When you work with communities like that, decoupling of society and cultures and nature is a persistent problem that in itself is a lot more important than the research itself. A research is a way to approach it, but the communities and nature agendas are the most important thing. So no, I keep on disliking the mere concept of metrics and the thing they focus on in measuring. They're so tight, and sometimes they take you take your focus somewhere else from the actual impact you would like to make, to be fair.
And it also doesn't take into account the impact that you have from that initial digital, the conversations that come out of that, or that knowledge that, or that feeling that you put into someone that, they bring up 2 years later. They're like, oh, I remember reading this article, or I remember having this interaction with this person, and now this is going to influence how I act in this specific moment, right? You can't quantify those things. And it's only through being present and reciprocity, et cetera, that we can really have an impact on each other. And metrics are never going to really show that. And yeah.
So here's a comment from C. Abbott. They ask us to consider, they may not be phrasing this perfectly, but they were wondering if the panel could speak to the ways that environmental history and environmental humanities feminisms can work to disrupt the supremacy of anti-Black, Indigenous, and people of color algorithms. Specifically, she's thinking about the ways that scholars can conduct themselves in digital spaces, including things like Twitter and Instagram.
I love this topic because I always love people thinking about their power, because every one of us has an algorithm and we all have power that we wield with it. And some of us has more power than others. A really good example of this in digital space was when white people posted those black squares and they had no idea that their algorithmic power was greater than the people of color that they were supposedly trying to speak up for or help. So instead of bringing to the forefront Black activists, they instead took over, because their power, their algorithmic power was more, right? So understanding that, and also we know that the alt-right has such a great understanding of algorithms, and they know how to push their ideas and they know how to work. And of course, the algorithms are kind of working for them, but that doesn't mean that we as activists, et cetera, can't learn how to use ours more thoroughly. So like, I always say to be very intentional about every interaction you make on the internet. People may not understand why I, with the niche account, spend so much time liking and retweeting people, but that's because niche has a big algorithmic power. Like we have algorithmic power, and I want to use that power to boost other people. So I take a lot of time to do that. And a lot of professional organizations don't do that with their accounts, right? They just tweet out, hey, we're having a conference next week, and then they peace out for 2 months, right? But I wanted niche to be different, and I wanted us to kind of, there's people behind it, and there's people behind the algorithm that we're using. So every single time you like, particularly if you're in behind the scenes, you see that every single like or every single retweet, comment, etc., interactions, how much they affect the way that the reach of a certain post, if you're looking at the metrics. But when you're just using your own accounts, etc., or if you are Googling, what articles you click on actually has a power to boost them in Google's algorithm, right? So just being very intentional and realizing that every single time that you interact with something, you are affecting the way that it reaches other people. And I encourage everyone to, I think about this a lot, but I still don't completely understand it. And I still have a lot to learn, and I try to learn more and more. But I encourage everyone to just kind of get a better understanding, because we often just, go into these online spaces kind of willy-nilly and have no idea how our actions, like what our actions are doing. So I think everyone should have some algorithm literacy. And I think that's something that we need as a society, as a broad. So, yeah.
Just to follow up on Jessica's point, and absolutely agree that the need to understand social media literacy, and the need to understand that the power and privilege that you have in the physical world also carries over into social media. And I think because we want to see social media as neutral, and because in the real world we want to avoid messy discussions about race, power, and privilege, that also carries over onto social media. And so you have the tool to disrupt it, but you have to be intentional. You have to be politically aware of, this is how you can also build allyship, by the retweeting, by the liking, by the comments. And this is also how a retweet from a white person, because of power and privilege in society and on social media, that retweet will go higher up the algorithm scale than it is from a person of color. And it's just being aware of that. And I think, yes, those damn black squares on Instagram, perfect example of that. And just with a little segue, I will also say, because of the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, what I'm seeing in the social media of environmentalism organizations is a lot more postings where people of color are included. And especially let's look at the Canadian one. And because so many people of color have discovered nature because of COVID, on the social media, literally there's a pre-COVID and a post-COVID. And in terms of the number of people of color faces showing up, it's like night and day. So that's been really powerful to see that. And at the same time, if it stops only at that, it becomes another tokenism, like those damn black squares, becomes another tokenistic gesture. And tokenistic gesture, almost virtue signaling to say, yeah, we see you, yeah, we hear you. But the real power in the organization, it's still the white wall. The real power in the academic scholarship, it's still the white framing. And yeah, it's being aware of that. But Jessica, spot on in terms of the algorithms. Yeah.
I have another question I'd like to move on to if anybody else, if everyone else agrees. This goes back a little bit, a comment earlier from the conversation that actually builds on a question that I had added to our draft questions document. So this is from Megan, and Megan asks, will the conversation be focused on academic spaces? And I want to add on that by asking this question: how can we use digital spaces to bridge the gap between digital academic spaces and non-academic spaces? And in what ways can we use these specific kinds of approaches to doing scholarship to get a larger part of the public to see the benefits of understanding the work that we do?
I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that all of us on the panel today either have our PhD or are going to have our PhD soon. And we did have Madeline Jubilee Sato on the panel today, who is going to speak more to the activist realm a bit. But Madeline couldn't join us today. But I want to fully acknowledge that this would be an excellent conversation to have amongst people who are not like us. And I think it would be completely different, right? No matter how much I want to connect myself to the activist realm, I'm still Dr. DeWitt. And that's how I navigate the world now, right? And I have to be really reticent of that. And that means that, again, when I'm in digital spaces, I try to use my power quietly, my algorithmic power quietly, to support people who are writing and tweeting, etc., who are not in academia. So I think part of it is listening and also being knowing how the power that you can wield just to support, and also asking people, instead of it's very easy for academics to take over spaces. And so when I am in a space, I try not to take up too much space and to ask what is wanted of me, right? So those are my initial thoughts on that. If anyone wants to step in.
I was just thinking on a subject we were talking about before we started, and that's speak as academic versus speak normally, because that kind of got stuck in my head, and probably because I just finished my PhD and just became doctor, and I'm not even used to the doctor title yet. I don't like to think on a gap between academia and the broader public or the rest of the world. I feel like I belong to both of them, or I'm borderline, but not just in one of those places. And as such, I don't limit myself and my interactions in the social media just to my subject of studies, for example. And that is, again, emphasizing in the concept of solidarity. When things like what happened in Melilla, for example, with the massacre of the Africans that were trying to cross the border to Spain. I was highly active because I had that feeling that no one's free until everybody's free, that your oppression is my oppression, and I just can't remain silent. I think that the silence in the case of Melilla was so loud in general in the massive media. So I don't know, that is to say that I'm still part of the world, even though I got a PhD, and probably we are the bridge in the gap, because we are there in between those two worlds. We're not a part of the world because we are PhDs or anything. We are still humans.
I think for me, I take public engagement seriously. And that means a lot of webinars, a lot of speaking, a lot of podcasts, because you're reaching a different audience there. And I'm very aware that depending on the audience, I'm still talking about the same topic, but my language may change. Because the language should not be a barrier to understanding what the bigger issues are. And I am motivated because the need to make sure that Black voices are presented at the activist level when it comes to environmentalism, that the Black voices are also present at the academic level when it comes to environmentalism, and especially in Canada, that it's the Canadian Black voices. We are very good at times of drawing on the American situation, and we use that as a way of avoiding our own hard discussions on how racism shapes the experience, the Canadian experience in environmentalism. And so for me, the public engagement is really important. So whether it's radio, whether it's print, the blog. And I think sometimes the public engagement might be looked down on by academics, as in proper academic work is that you've got to be published in these peer-reviewed journals. Yeah, I've had a couple of articles. Yes, I'm on the beginning of my career, but an awful lot of my writing is more journalistic and it's gone in a different direction. And I am learning to value that as part of a public engagement, public outreach strategy, as a way of taking some of the academic discussions and saying, no, these are not just ivory tower navel gazing. These actually have real world consequences, and try to illustrate, here is a real world example of what this academic idea or this academic framing means. It's a lot of work because you're constantly code switching, but code switching in terms of language, code switching in terms of when you're doing the public engagement, not be seen to be talking down to people because that's just arrogance, but be seen as reframing your language so that your goal is clear communication. Yeah, your goal is not academic name dropping. Oh, look at me, I know this. It's more around, here's an idea. This is what it means. This is how it plays out in real world consequences. And this is why it's important, because there is no planet B.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Diana, do you have a comment? Otherwise, I can share another question from the audience. No? Okay. Sorry. So this question is also from Feminist Digital Methods, but it overlaps with another question that we had already been previously thinking through. So I'm going to read both of them. So the question from Feminist Digital Methods is, how do you navigate safety security needs as well as counter erasure in a digital space? And then another way to put it is, what are some of the negative aspects of maintaining a digital presence? And do you have any advice for people about how to create meaningful interactions in their digital scholarship and writing? So safety, but also still trying to maintain connection. How do we do those things?
Very quickly, for me, it's recognizing that digital space is work. I publish a blog every Friday. The blog does not come straight out of my head onto the computer. The research, the writing, everything that goes into it. And so the way that I manage that is by making it part of my workday. The same with Twitter. Instagram, I'm struggling a little bit with, and that may just be a generational divide because I'm still trying to get my head around that blurring of the personal and the academic and the political. But it's recognizing that it is work. Um, there is also, I think what Jessica had said earlier about presenting your whole self on social media, that really resonates with me. And so I do that to make sure the person you see on Twitter and the person you meet in person are actually the same. There isn't a filter or the pretense. I really make sure that it's genuine. Um, so that's one other issue. Another issue, the safety, that's important. And especially for Black academics, for Palestinian academics, for general Indigenous academics, we seems to be the one that the trolling is really pointed at. And it's disappointing when Canadian publications like turn off their comments because they know the amount of racist vitriol they're going to get when it's opposed by a Black or Indigenous or Palestinian academic. And it's like, really, guys, this is your level of support that you're giving? It just astounds me that that is the way that you're doing it. But for academics from those groups, there's an extra layer of burden that we carry. And it's like, why should we be the one who have to carry that burden alone? And there was a tweet on Twitter this morning from Afua Cooper, one of the really great Canadian historians. She's just done a CBC interview talking about Emancipation Day and Canadian slavery. And in the tweet, she's saying, again, it's the level of vitriol that she's getting because of that on social media. So I think for any kind of, if you're an activist academic, and especially if you're an activist academic who's Black, Indigenous, Palestinian people of color from those equity seeking groups, there's a level of vitriol that you do get. And so the need to establish boundaries about what you will deal with, what you will not deal with, the need to find people who have been through the same experience to talk to as a way of gaining that support is there. And it also then means for me that publications need to take the extra step in terms of having support services available for those academics and offering those support services and then being active on the social media so that they are aware of what's happening and not put the whole burden on the academic to carry through. But yeah, it's an issue. The trolling is always there and it's a real issue.
I'm going to add to this as a white academic. I have been doxxed before. There's threads on Reddit about me. And I am queer, but I'm fairly heteronormative presenting, so I don't get a lot of vitriol for that. But the things that I have experienced, because I am white, I have been able to ride out. And I find that it's my responsibility to do that in a lot of ways to make the spaces more safer for other people. And when I do social media workshops, I always try to speak to the white cis men in the room and say that it is your responsibility to help your the women, the queer, people of color, etc., colleagues and friends on the internet when they are facing vitriol, and it's time for them to step up. They're the ones who should be responding to the trolls. They're the ones. I always say that, you know, when someone says something stupid to me on Twitter or elsewhere, I just ignore them because If I don't respond to them, they don't have any power. But that's easy for me to do. And so I think it's also respecting what other people need to do to feel safe, whether that's blocking a lot of people, whether it's having a private account, whether that's asking to have their blog posts taken down or the comments turned off of it, etc. So really respecting people's boundaries. And I think, again, as algorithm, we should have literacy in that. We also need to have digital literacy in presenting boundaries and how we need to do that. And that's another conversation for another day. But I think that's a skill set that we need to work on, so that people have concrete steps. They know exactly how they can set up boundaries in digital spaces. Yeah.
Another question for us to consider as a sort of maybe counterexample to a previous conversation would be, do you have any success stories of meaningful interactions or things that have worked well for you that you want to share? Eliminating as many personal details as you feel is appropriate, of course. But talking about the good ways that the digital spaces have helped us, I think can also be a meaningful way to share tactics that have worked or things that have been useful for people.
I mean, I've left academia, technically. I'm academia adjacent is how I call myself. So I owe my entire career at this point to my digital presence. I would not have been able to leave academia and do what I'm doing as an editor, digital strategist, etc., if I had not fostered a digital presence and learned these skills on my own as a grad student. So I want to say that. And also, I have such a tremendous international network of friends, like the people here, like I consider you friends, and I've still never, like, we haven't met in person, right? But I feel a connection to you, and I love supporting you digitally. And my best friend Sarah is in the audience. I organized this conference. We haven't seen each other in years because of COVID, but we talk to each other daily. Or Caroline's in the audience, and Caroline and I met on Instagram, and now Caroline is one of our editors at Niche. So, and we've never met in person. So these are all things that have happened. I owe so much good things to my digital presence, even though sometimes it's a slog. And as Jacqueline says, it is work. It's work, and you have to take it seriously. Anyways, someone else can go.
The good thing that's come out of the digital presence for me is connections. I have learned to use hashtags and use them effectively. So whether it's Black Birders Week, which connected me to a whole bunch of other Black people who enjoy bird watching. And yes, it was sparked by the incident with Kristen Cooper, but we turned what could have been a potential tragedy into a celebration that here Black people bird watching. When I think, and that has launched a whole ton of Black in Nature, Black in Enviro Week, Black Botanist Week, Black in Neuroscience, Black in the Arctic. And so it's through social media that different academics working in environmentalism who are Black across a massive range of disciplines, we've gone from usually being the only one in our group to, hey, wait a minute, there's a whole ton of us out there that we didn't know, but we're connecting through social media. I mean, another one is Black in the Ivory Tower, which talks about what is it like to be a Black academic. So I am eternally grateful to digital space for making those connections and for showing me that there's a broader world out there and that I can connect to it as a Black person in that space, and that the things I have to say, I don't always have to explain them. That's only possible because of social media. And for that, yeah, I am grateful. So yeah, it's been that's the really good part of it that I enjoy. And that is what motivates me to keep on at Twitter and keep on doing the blogging. Because yeah, it's a nice spark when they say, yeah, we're doing good. We're coming through. We're making change.
Yes, yes. I would say I'll add to that. When you have a digital presence, even though me, I don't really see at least not Twitter's work, because I had it for a long time and it's been like my personal account. But people have reached me through my account because they already got to know my work through it. Like probably one of the cases I like the most is actually one of the peasant leaders of one of the communities I work with in my PhD reached to me because they heard a podcast I recorded long ago, talking about their perspective to a certain socio-environmental conflict that they're living in their territory, and they asked me to visit them and see the situation for my own. And then when I went to visit, they said, "Please consider us to be part of your research. We would like to be there." And I found it really, really encouraging. Like that's ideal to work with people that actually want to work with you and are eager to participate. And that was sort of part of my digital presence as well. So I keep it friendly, kindly, kind, caring, not as that work tool that much as I probably should now that I am properly a PhD. But yeah, I think I've been approachable and I'm happy with that.
Thank you, everyone. If there aren't any more comments about this question, I think we should wrap things up. And I'm going to give everyone the opportunity to share a closing comment if there's something that they want to say, if they haven't already said. Now's your chance.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope there'll be many more like this. But thank you.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize thanks for this platform and conversation. It's been really fruitful, and I think one of the things that I'm continuously thinking about is how we can sort of dismantle and rebuild. I don't want to say build back better, but dismantle and rebuild. Because I think one of the things that, to me at least, stands out is how we need to rethink the very fundamentals of how we approach knowledge formation, knowledge dissemination, and the impact of that sort of knowledge creation, especially embedding it in communities, right? So thank you. Lots to think about.
This has been so lovely. I could talk, we could chat for another 3 hours, but the audience is thinned out, understandably. But this was great. And I think there's so much more to talk about. And yeah, I'm just grateful for all of you who I've all met digitally. And let's continue to do good work together.
Yeah, I add up to that. Like, thank you so much for inviting us and for this conversation. Lots of love to everybody.
All right, everyone. So this will
yeah, care and kindness is kind of a great message for digital presence.
All right, everyone. Well, this concludes our discussion today. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for sharing your thoughts and expertise and kindness today to the audience members. For those of you whose questions did not get answered, I apologize for that, but feel free to keep those conversations moving in other circles. And thank you again for attending today.